بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على النبي المبعوث رحمة ونورا للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا وعلمنا وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya of Imam Birgivi, we are completing our look at wastefulness by looking at what is the treatment of wastefulness, right? And wastefulness, of course, is so important because it gives, we talked about wastefulness and how it relates to faith, wastefulness, how it relates to restraint, and how restraint relates to taqwa, wastefulness and how it relates to gratitude. Restraint also, wastefulness also goes against the essential comportment of the believer. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Alaykum bis-sakinati wal-waqar," that you should uphold serenity and dignified restraint, waqar. Right? This restraint is an important value in our religion, right? The restraint that enables us to avoid wastefulness. So what is the treatment for wastefulness? The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam al-Birgivi, tells us, المبحث الخامس في علاج الإسراف وهو ثلاثة. Right? There are three ways to treat being wasteful. And these are the three ways we approach anything. There is knowledge, العلاج العلمي. Secondly, there's knowledge to know what, why, how, and then the requisite action that avoids wastefulness. Right? In anything, there are broadly three ways of treating it. There's knowledge. Second, what is the action that deals with wastefulness? And the third is al-qal'i, the extricative method. And the extricative method is to remove its causes. Right? And there's, of course, a proximate removal of its causes. And then there's a wider removal of causes, right? That, which is what is indicated by Maulana Ibn Ata'illah, that the basis of every sin and blameworthy quality, one of the bases is ghafla, is being heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Is being heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the foundational facilitative grace for all good. Right? Which is why one of the final advices of Sayyid Abul Hasan al-Shadhili, when he was asked for advice, he told his student, "I'rafillah, know Allah." Right? ثم كن كما شئت, then be as you wish. Because if you uphold this concept that I'm going to live a life of one who knows Allah, then the choices you make will be choices of a knower of Allah, one who knows who's your Lord, what you owe your Lord, what your Lord seeks from you. Then the way of action becomes clear and evident and without confusion or doubt. So these are the three treatments: knowledge, action, and removal. Right? So he says, al-awwal,
الأول علمي وهو معرفة غوائله السابقة واستماع ما ذكرنا والتأمل فيه والمداومة على التذكر.
Right? So the knowledge-based cure is to know the harms of wastefulness that have been previously mentioned. Right? And we looked so much at what are the harms of wastefulness, right? And one of the reasons it's important to remind oneself of both harmful consequences of the blameworthy and the praiseworthy consequences of the good is that the nature of the human being is that they're prone to forgetfulness. So without that reminder, the right choices become difficult. Right? If you, we have someone in our family when they're a kid, they're about to go to sleep and they hadn't prayed Isha yet. So it said, pray Isha. They said, I'm only 6 right now. And technically you don't even have to tell me right now that I have to pray Isha. So I said, what would the Sahaba do? So literally he jumped up on the bed and turned in the jump towards the Qibla. Then realized he was going to be ended up praying on like as a bed without legs. So he took a step off the bed and did his whole Isha prayer. Right? Because it's only when you remember the bigger picture are the choices so much clearer. Right? And this is why it's so important for the believer to have that general living connection with the Quran and that general living connection with the ahadith al-fada'il, right? The hadiths on the virtues, right? Fada'il al-akhlaqi wa fada'il al-a'mal, the virtuous traits of character and also the virtuous actions. Because without those, we lose perspective. There's a fundamental difference between you being told that Salatul Duha is recommended and to hear that the Prophet ﷺ never left Salatul Duha. That such and such has come about Salatul Duha. Such and such has come about Salatul Duha. The fundamental difference. Right? So likewise, things like wastefulness. Right? It's to know it, to know the harms of wastefulness, and to listen to what we have mentioned. Right? Meaning of the many verses and hadiths on the blameworthiness of waste. وَالتَّأَمُّلُ فِيهِ, and to reflect upon it. Right? Because knowledge without reflection is that like a lamp without light. Right? Right? Knowledge without reflecting upon it, like you have a lamp, but there's no light. That's why what does Ibn Ata'illah says? Al-fikratu sirajul qulub. Reflection is the light-giving lamp of hearts. Without them, hearts remain in darkness. Right? وَالْمُدَاوَمَةُ عَلَى التَّذَكُّرِ, and to consistently remind oneself. In order for you to be able to go from wastefulness to restraint. Right? If there's a quality that you're struggling with, right, keep reminding yourself. It's not a mistake people make with spiritual teachings, with religious teachings. Say, I read it. There's something you need to work on. Keep repeating it. Right? Keep reflecting on it. Keep taking heed. And one of the practical ways of taking heed, the ulama mentioned, is to say, okay, what are the key points that I have to remember? Right? So to personalize the knowledge. Right? They say, I struggle most with wastefulness when it comes to how much paper I throw away, how much I do this. So these are things for me to avoid. So if you're working on, you should be always working on something that you're trying to improve on yourself. So it's important to go back to that this is the benefit of works like Tariq al-Muhammadi, etc. Okay, there's something I'm working on, so you keep reviewing that section to remind yourself. But then also, which are the parts that you need to work most on, so you remind yourself of those. Okay. So that is the knowledge method, right? Is knowing, reviewing, reflecting, and regularly reminding oneself, right? So it becomes palpable, right? Okay. والثاني
والثاني عملي وهو التكلف في الإمساك ونصب رقيب عليه يعاتبه ويذكره آفات الإسراف.
Right? The second is the practical treatment. It's the practical treatment, which is to make takalluf, right? Right? Is to exert effort in restraining from wastefulness. Right? So, for example, if you are someone who is excessive in buying things, right? Force yourself not to do it. Exaggerate. How? Like you do one-click shopping all the time. Remove your credit card or your debit card or whatever from the thing. So you're not able to just do that action right away. Make takalluf, right? Force yourself to exert effort in being restrained. If it's in spending, then put barriers between you and that spending. I have someone I know quite well. Their spouse and them, they agreed that they wouldn't keep a debit card. This is years ago. So the spouse would just, for a period of time, would just give them cash to spend. Because they would become quite generous with buying for the family and buying for themselves. And then after a while, they rebalanced their spending patterns. Right? So this is oneself. The other is to appoint someone to watch over one who would correct one. Right? It could be a family member, could be your spouse, could be a sibling, could be a friend. Right? That you say, so I have a friend in Jordan who was quite generous with his social spending. So his closest friend, they agreed that, look, I'll give you a weekly report on how I spent my money. And so sometimes I'd be in the meeting and say, look, don't be mad at me. I can explain. He said, you haven't even told me what you spent this week. I said, but I can explain. Look, I had guests over. I said, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Right? But you learn by having to report to somebody. Right? Could be a family member, could be a friend. Right? With spending, one of the ways they suggest is force yourself to use cash. This is one of the harms of a cashless economy, right? You don't feel the pinch. I know one of the things they suggest is sort of, like the old world way of, like, you have your monthly budget, put it into envelopes. That I'll spend this on this, this on this, this on this. So you break it down in that way. So you slow down. If you put more steps between you and the wastefulness, the more difficult it becomes. Right? If your wastefulness is with using too much water, just go below the sink and reduce the water flow. So that in order to run the tap much more highly, you'd have to really exaggerate opening it, right? So you put the steps so that you make it difficult to waste. Right? Some people would suggest, for example, that if you want to realize the gravity of how much food you're wasting, don't keep your garbage bin in the kitchen. Why? Because then to throw away the food, you'd have to leave the kitchen, and then you'll realize, oh my goodness, we're throwing away so much food. Like put it in the garage or something, right? So if you have to throw away the food, you have to put some extra steps. So it helps you realize, the gravity of waste, right? Or other things that if food goes bad because you have too many things in the fridge, then be very careful. Then exaggerate buying less until you build up till you hit the right balance. So these are all having someone to help you, right? And it is one of the great facilitators, right? And this is from the facilitative rules of ukhuwa, of brotherhood, right? They say لا خير في أخوة لا نصح فيها. There's no good in brotherhood in which there's no sincere counsel. But at the same time, that kind of brotherhood sometimes can be rare. Right? So and that's the and from the practical ways as well that facilitates this is to make it a habit that anything that in the things you're wasteful, consult before you act. And consult with the intention that I'll implement the consultation. Yes, if you're a student of knowledge and you just buy too many books, consult. Although sometimes the shuyukh wouldn't be too helpful because they'll say, yeah, just buy it. But consult someone whose consultation is worthy so they can help you balance things out. Right? And someone who'd remind you of the harms of wastefulness, right? But the danger of consultation, though, is that sometimes it can produce the wrong results, right? Because let's say if you spend too much in charity, right? If you consult your cousin who's a financial planner, what are they trying to optimize towards? If they decide, I'm going to help Uncle Sufyan become wealthy, are you trying to optimize towards dunya? No. We're trying to optimize towards al-iqtisadu al-mahmud, right? The praiseworthy balance, right? Which is that golden balance between al-ifrat wa tafriq, between excessiveness and remissness by the standards of revelation. Right? So you need to be careful, right? Especially on money matters. Sometimes people consult financial planners, etc., but they forget to plan for their akhirah. Because by financial planning, why would you be giving in charity unless it's of tax advantage? Right? So that ends up being disadvantageous. Okay. والثالث
والثالث قلعي وهو معرفة أسبابه ثم إزالتها.
Right? The third way is قلعي, is extractionary. The third of the treatments for waste is extractionary, which is the removal of its causes, which is to know the causes of wastefulness and then removing them. Right? Then removing them. Right? Because إذا زال السبب زال المسبب. If you remove the cause, the effect it causes is removed. Right? So they say, تعالج الأمراض بإزالة عللها. Right? Or they say تعالج الأمراض بتعيين عللها ثم إزالتها. Right? That you treat a sickness by identifying its cause or its causes and then extricating those causes. Right? So if there's a fire in the woods, the common person would go and try to extinguish the flames. The wise person would ignore the flames and go and find what is the source of the fire. And that's why in life you need both simple people and the wise, because the wise alone could find the source of the fire, but the forest could burn down in the meantime, right? So God loves the common man. That's why He made so many of them. They go deal with the flames. The wise go and deal with the fire. You need both. Okay, so and he says, وَهِيَ سِتَّةٌ. There are 6 causes of wastefulness. Right? الأول وهو الغالب السفه. The first of the causes of wastefulness, and said this is the predominant cause of wastefulness, is folly, is safah. Right? وهو الحادي والثلاثون أي من آفات القلب. And it is the 31st of the blameworthy traits of the heart, is folly. Now, folly is not a judgment on a person. Right? It is not an assessment of their natural intellectual aptitude. That he's a 47 on the Chaudhary intellect scale, and he's a 51 and she's a 67. No. So number A was a fool, number C wasn't. Right? No. Safah is defined as
وهو ضعف العقل وخفته وسخافته وركاكته وضده الرشد وهو قوة العقل وبلوغه كماله. قال الله تعالى: ولا تؤتوا السفهاء أموالكم. ثم قال: فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فادفعوا إليهم أموالهم.
Right? So, so what is folly? Right? He says folly is lack of intellect, and its weakness, and its brittleness, right? And its weakness, right? Its shallowness, its weakness, right? So it's lack of intellect. But what is intellect? Right? Right? Here, we're not talking about like intellectual brilliance. We're talking about practical intelligence, right? Practical intelligence. And practical intelligence here, is understood by the opposite of folly, which is rushd, and its opposite is rushd, right? Which is having right. It is having rushd is literally is being rightfully guided. It's to be rightfully guided, or having the capacity for making right choices. Right? So folly is the incapacity, is the weakness in your capacity to make right choices. That is what folly is. Right? Folly is the weakness of your capacity to make right choices. So you could be an intelligent fool. Someone could be winning prizes for science or literature or this or that, but then they blow their whole budget on Chinese food. And they keep buying sunglasses. And then they're not able to pay their bills. So we're not judging whether they're intellectually brilliant. This is folly is the weakness in the capacity to make right choices. And rushd is, in one sense, rushd is right guidance. Right? So we have al-khulafa al-rashidun, who are the rightly guided caliphs. But rushd, as a quality of the intellect, he says, it's the strength of the intellect. And it's reaching its completeness. But what strength of the intellect in what sense? Is the strength of your intellect's capacity to make and follow right choices. And Allah Most High says, do not give the foolish their wealth. Right? Do not give the foolish their wealth. Right? Meaning that, if you have the guardianship over someone, your child, do you give your child all access to their whole bank account as soon as they hit puberty? No. You wait until, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, so don't give the foolish, and someone who hits puberty is still foolish in that sense that they lack the capacity to make right choices. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said this from Surah An-Nisa, verses 5 and 6. Then if you find in them rushd, right, the capacity to make right choices, then give them their money. Right? Then give them their money. Right? And how do you do this practically as a parent or guardian? Give them a little bit of money. Right? And monitor how they handle it. Right? So you give them you build their capacity to make right choices. Right? So even before they hit, they hit puberty, you give them an allowance. Help them build the capacity to make right choices, responsible choices. Right? And then when they hit puberty, let's say 14, 15, till they reach 18, you give them a sense of money and how they spend it and what they spend it on, etc. But this is the idea of, so a person is not born with right judgment. Right judgment is acquired. Either through tarbiyah, right? By someone being disciplined by a parent or a mentor, or by mujahada, by striving to rectify one's state. So then he says, rahimahullah,
وأكثر السفه طبيعي وقد ينضم إليه ما يقويه على الإقدام على كثرة الإسراف وهو تملك المال بغير كسب وتعب وحث جلسائه على الإنفاق وتنفيرهم عن الإمساك ليأكلوا ماله ويأخذوه فلذا نهي عن جليس السوء. وهذا النوع من الإسراف يكثر في أولاد الأغنياء.
So he says, a lot of folly is temperamental, right? Is from someone's natural disposition, right? Some people are born very, even as children, they only take a little bit of food, they only do this, and others are born expansive. They'll throw away things, etc. They're just negligent by nature, right? That's the tab'a, by nature. So a lot of folly is by nature. People are just have a negligent temperament. But there are factors that can be added to someone's temperament, to someone's nature, that strengthen their tendency to be more wasteful. So they're already, by temperament, negligent and given to wastefulness. But there are things that strengthen this tendency. Amongst that is acquiring wealth without having earned it and without having had to tire for it. And amongst the things are if one's companions encourage one to spend, meaning excessively, and they keep discouraging him from not spending. So someone, for example, is trying to save up to go on Hajj. They're trying to save up to clear some debts that they owe. Zubayr got married and he borrowed $50,000 from Uncle Jamil. Now trying to save up to pay that back. But his friends saying, Yar, you're so boring. Join us for there's a new cut of halal, Kobe, Wagyu, organic, God knows what, naturally dried, whatever steak. It blows $500 on steak in one night. Okay? So, one's sitting companions encouraging one to spend or to be wasteful in some other way, and discouraging one from withholding. And sometimes it is because they want to consume the person's wealth. As someone earned money, this is why if you look at the shocking statistics of professional athletes, for example, bankruptcy rates amongst professional athletes are shocking. Why? And it's usually not them themselves who adopted lavish lifestyles, but it's the scavengers around them, right? Who urge them on. And this is amongst the reasons why the prohibition has come against keeping ill company, harmful company. It is harmful for you in your deen. It's also harmful for you in your dunya. Right? And this type of wastefulness occurs frequently amongst the children of the wealthy. Right? Especially if their parents aren't careful to inculcate in them values of restraint. Right? There are two brothers that I know who, mashallah, their father was an extremely wealthy businessman, multimillionaire. But he was a person of piety. He was a searcher for truth. He's the one who pointed them towards Islam. He never found it. He found some writings of some Muslim scholars, but he never met Muslims. But he told his children that you can find the truth in the writings of so-and-so. They try to read that person's writings. They didn't understand a word that scholar was saying. But then they found the writings of Ibn Ata'illah Secondary. Anyways, so the two sons whom I've met and I've stayed with them are extremely wealthy. Very successful business. However, the older son was still driving their father's car as of a few years ago. That was over 30 years old. Over 30 years old. I knew this looks like an old car. But it looked dignified. They kept it clean, this and that. Kept the engine running well, etc. But a 30-year-old car is a 30-year-old car. Said it works. It gets us from point A to point B. The air conditioning works. The engine's in good condition. And you look at how they dressed, how they lived, and they have, some nice comforts. The houses are nicely decorated, elegant, tasteful, but you wouldn't think that they have anything extra. We attended a retreat held on their farm, a few hours from the city. There's people who are attending the retreat for the third year who didn't know whose farm this was, of the locals. All they thought, these two brothers are just the people organizing this. They didn't realize this is their house and everybody's staying at their house and they're covering all the expense and they're paying for the food and they're all these things. Why? Because that's the value of good parenting, right? These values were inculcated within them, but also they cultivated that restraint. But it's a good example that by not spending in wasteful ways, they were able to direct their money towards so much of the good. Right? That's why the early Muslims said that من اشتغل بما لا يعنيه فاته كثير مما يعنيه. If one busies oneself with the things that are not of benefit to one will miss out on much that is of great benefit to one. Right? So, right? And then he says, وَقَدْ يَحْصُلْ
السفه أو يزيد برعاية الناس له وبتعظيمهم إياه وتغريرهم وثنائهم كما في أولاد الكبراء من الأمراء والقضاة والمدرسين والمشايخ ونحوهم.
Right? And folly, right, could arise or increase by people paying attention to them and respecting them and honoring them and praising them, as happens to the children of the notable. Right? They may be children of people of prominence in society. So they're not necessarily wealthy, but they have status, right? Such as, children of politicians, for example. Not politicians, politicians, are politicians by default wealthy in a place like here? No, not necessarily. But they're always in the media, they're always in the media. They have, so people look up to them, praise them. Or, like the children of the rulers, or in the old days, the children of the judges, because the judges were respected. Or the children of the scholars, of the teaching scholars, the mudarrisin, the teaching scholars. Right? Because teaching was very noble thing, like that, the head teacher would be a well-rounded scholar. Not anybody could be the head teacher. Right? Well, mashayikh and the scholars of the spiritual path, they may be broke, but they're influencers, right? Everyone said, we want to meet your father. Said, no, I'll arrange it, and so on, right? So now from that, what happens? They make foolish choices. Why? Because people are paying attention to them. So instead of, for example, taking care of their responsibilities, they have to take care of their spending on their wife, their children, spending on their need, their benefit. They're like, look, I need to dress well because everybody comes to set up appointments with Sayyidina al-Walid, with our father, etc. So they're decked up fancy, and we have to do this and that, and then they go buy a fancy car. Why? Because I have to drive dad. Right? So they end up being very frivolous in their spending. Why? Because of status. Right? So folly can arise from the children of the wealthy, but also the children of those who have status, right? So these are things to be careful about, right? But also folly, there's other manifestations of folly. One of them is haste, right? From the manifestations of folly is also one of the really grave ones is al-ajala, right? Is haste. And we've talked about haste. Right? Is haste, right? When one makes quick decisions. And the Prophet ﷺ said, وَالْعَجَلَةُ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ. And there's a saying in English, haste makes waste. Because you don't consider. So you just get it anyways. Like a lot of the food that gets wasted, you went shopping, you said, okay, we need to buy cheese. Okay, let's get this one, this one, this one, this one, and some of it goes bad. Right? So one of the ways to avoid that is to think things through before one acts. That is of the examples of safa, right? Is al-ajala, right? Another of the manifestations of safa, of foolishness in our times is al-isgha ila al-i'lan, right? Ila al-i'lam, right? Is to listen to media, is to follow media, right? Now, the silliest thing you can do is to actually, like people, is to follow, like people, why do people spend millions advertising on like the Super Bowl or this or that? Because are they giving sadaqah? No. Why? Because they want you to consume, right? Why are these social media platforms free, quote unquote? Because people are advertising there, right? They're paying for your attention. Why do they want your attention? Because they want you to buy things that you otherwise would not buy. Right? Nobody's like, Facebook's not there providing a free service. Right? Facebook wants you to spend as much time as possible on their platform so they can run as many ads as possible on you so they make money, and the people who've paid to run the ads for you to purchase their products or services. But that leads to foolish decisions. You have a baklava store right around the corner, but you see some nice ad for exclusive gourmet baklava dipped in chocolate. I almost bought some last night, even though I don't eat baklava. But I realized what a foolish thing to do. I didn't think about the tariqa Muhammadiyya. But I'm very ad prone. Normally I have my ad blockers on, but following media and particularly looking at ads, right? They say Steve Jobs had a reality distortion field around him, metaphorically speaking, not an actual reality distortion field, right? So you listen to him, you'll go buy his products. Who told you to watch some company's ad? Right? Why? Because it skews your choices. Right? To the extent you can, do not watch ads. Why? Be a rational animal. See what are my necessities, what are my needs, what are my wants. Right? And know what choices you're making on the basis of these are the essentials for myself, my family, worldly essentials, religious essentials. What are our needs? The things that it would be difficult to do without. And then what are our wishes? Right? what are beneficial wishes and what are frivolous. Right? And the expensive chocolate dipped baklava being flown in from Turkey when you can get baklava down the road for 1/3 of the price is safa. So this is one of the causes of safa, right? Immersing oneself in worldly media and all of it. And there's nothing unethical about ad blocking. Right? So if you're surfing the internet, whatever, use the best ethical, best lawful tools to block all or nearly all ads. Get off platforms that you cannot get off, that you cannot avoid advertising on. Because it's, and also just avoid unnecessary, because they're designed to cultivate wants, even religious. You didn't have to buy that very expensive Islamic accessory. Why did you buy it? Because you kept seeing an ad for it. Right? And I'm really bad at getting stuck in this. I ended up buying a particularly expensive Islamic accessory for somebody. I didn't want to tell them that it was particularly expensive, and I don't think they'd even appreciated it. I was thinking of actually just taking it away and giving it to charity on their behalf, because they have many such accessories, but Islamically I couldn't justify doing that because it's their property. But you end up making and inshallah you get rewarded for some spending, but you end up making wasteful choices, right? So these are causes for, right, that one of the things that you have to avoid wastefulness and to have rushd in your decision making, strengthening your capacity to make right choices, is to remove the impediments to good choices. And of the worst of them is directly is advertising. Number 2 is time spent on the internet in places where advertising is present, which is everywhere. Thirdly, be careful how you shop. Shop purposefully. How do you shop purposefully? Before you shop, decide what you need. Decide what you need. And that helps even with books. I'm a notorious book buyer, but even then, when I travel, because I know if I bought everything I want, I'd blow any imaginary budget and borrow money and still not quench my whims for books. So whenever I travel overseas, I make a list of the books I'm going to buy. I do my best to stick to the list, and I try to be careful beyond that. Sometimes deliberately don't go shopping. There's one particularly large bookstore in Istanbul. I actually looked at the map of the bookstore that I was only going to go to this area, and this area, and nowhere else. Why? Because I could only spend $500. Right? I entered the bookstore with the intention, I am lowering my gaze for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was tough because I knew there's a lot of other good books out there that I'd want to get, but I couldn't because then I'd have to ship them, etc. And I still ended up spending significantly more than $500. That was besides the shipping for those books. So, but as best one can, one is purposeful. And of course, that's spending in the good. Right? Likewise, other situations that if you go to the mall, for example, don't go to the mall and let's see what we find. No, go purposefully. Know what you're getting and then go. Don't go onto any particular website and say, okay, let's see what's available. Let's look at their recommendations. You're a slave to them. Are they encouraging rushd or safa for you? Right? So if you can opt out of, do not let them give you recommendations. Right? They're not giving you recommendations based on what you need. They're stirring your desires, directly and indirectly. There's one person in marketing said, if you give me 3 facts about yourself, if I can track 3 things about yourself, I know you as well as you know yourself. If you give me 6 points of data, I know you better than you know yourself. Right? And you need to understand how people, like the psychology of influence and behavioral psychology, and how people influence your decision making. And you got to create barriers between their promoting foolish choices for you in order for you to make right choices. Because that's where wastefulness arises from. And so those are some of the challenges that we face with wastefulness. Also, he pointed towards, these social. He mentions 2 scenarios of wastefulness amongst the children of the wealthy and social status. But your social circles will cause you to be wasteful. Everybody bought a new phone, so you feel, I need to buy a new phone. Do you have a new phone? Right? But imagine if all your friends were always just talking about the new phones. You might start thinking, I need a new phone. Right? Now, I haven't looked at your phone, but you're not the kind of guy who does that kind of stuff. Right? Is there any grave harm in you having an old phone? I don't know if it's old, but of being a non-new phone? No, it does the job. Right? So a lot of times, one's influenced by the social circles one is in. So it's not only the children of the wealthy, but the circles you're in, whether they're money-driven circles or status-driven circles. All the other doctors are driving fancy cars. I need to drive a fancy car. I have a friend whose his 2 older brothers both paid $100,000 in mahr before 1997. That's when I met my friend. His brothers had married before 97. And his older brothers are both self-made multimillionaires. But one of them, I actually visited his house. He would drive a $150 minivan, like a $150 old van. Why? He said a car is seats on wheels. Right? If it gets you from point A to B without danger and without harm for you or others, it does the job. And everything else is frivolous. Now, he was fine with a rickety old car, but a lot of things that, and it's not a call to do without, but it's a call to do without foolish choices. Right? To do without foolish choices. That's why we took the idea of there's no wastefulness in the good, but there's also no good in wastefulness. Right? So a choice just made because Majid got a new hat, I need to get one too. Why? Now, if Majid got a good pair of shoes that he used to slip in the ice, and he said, look, I stopped slipping on ice because I got this pair of shoes that don't slip, that look elegant for work, but don't cause me to slip. So I said, you know what? I slip when I walk to work. So I get the same shoes. I'm not trying to keep up with the Majids, but rather, I'm trying to pursue something of benefit for me. But this social pressure is one of the great things that just keeps people from benefit overall, but that causes them to make foolish choices. Okay. So this folly has many, many manifestations. The third is, so that's the first, folly. So what are the causes? What are the underlying causes of wastefulness? The first is folly. والثاني
الجهل بمعنى الإسراف أو ببعض أصنافه فلا يظنه سرفا بل يظنه سخاء لاشتراكهما في بذل غير الواجب
What?
أو بحرمته وضرره.
Right? A second cause of wastefulness is to be ignorant of the meaning of wastefulness, that you don't realize that many of the ways of spending or use are actually wasteful. Right? So you take, for example, you put post-it notes everywhere. So you take a big piece of, big post-it note, and you write one thing on the post-it note, then you throw it away. Although if you thought about it, you could have, that one post-it note, you could have cut it into 3. Right? It's wasteful. You just had to write your grocery list. You took a whole piece of paper. You could have just taken half the piece of paper, for example. Right? So ignorance of the meaning of wastefulness or of some of its types. So one doesn't imagine them to be wasteful, but rather, for example, you may think it's being generous. Because generosity and wastefulness share the meaning of spending something that is not obligatory to spend. But generosity is spending where spending is praiseworthy. Right? So, for example, you bought you decide to buy some fancy Yemeni coffee. And then you gift some to a friend. Do you make fancy coffee at home? No. So if someone gave you $150 a pound coffee, would you know what to do with it? No. Right? So someone may think it's generous. So look, I wanted to buy coffee. Now, I would never buy $150 coffee. But let's say you gifted it to a friend who would appreciate it. You also gifted it to a friend who honestly, go out for a meal with them, they might appreciate it. And you spend $20 on the meal, but $150 of coffee seems like you're being generous, but you're not. Why? Because what is waste? Waste is spending without benefit. Would you appreciate the $150 exclusive Yemeni coffee over just a cup from Starbucks or wherever? No. Then that spending on you would be wasteful. But there's other things that you would appreciate. Like the good karahi chicken, for example. So, or ignorance of the prohibited nature of wastefulness and its harms, which we've looked at in the previous lessons. See, waste is not good, but it's my stuff. No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we've seen, has firmly prohibited wastefulness. The Prophet ﷺ strongly warned against wastefulness. So ignorance is one of the sources of harm. Heedlessness, ignorance, lack of restraint, these are governing harms. And then 3, 4, and 5. والسادس
والثالث الرياء والسمعة والرابع الكسل والبطالة والخامس ضعف النفس وهو الذي يسميه العوام حياء والسادس ضعف الدين فلا يهتم له.
Okay. The third of the causes of wastefulness is showing off and seeking the praise of people. Right? People will do the weirdest things to show off. Right? Someone has back trouble and she's already married or he's already married. Whenever they wear uncomfortable shoes, it hurts their posture and aggravates their back condition. But it's a wedding and they want to flaunt fancy new shoes because their circle of friends, everybody wears fancy shoes. So you buy uncomfortable shoes that going to hurt your even disadvantage. So you waste money that you can't afford just to show off. Or that people talk that, so you have friends who all like fountain pens. So you notice that Zayn has a nice looking pen. I know where I can get a good pen from. And you kind of strategically keep the logo, make it prominent so that people know you got a glucose-filed pen or whatever. People say, oh, he got a glucose-filed. Those are at least $500. And you end up wasting money for what? Just to show off and for summa, that people talk about you. The fourth is laziness. Or just negligence. Right? A lot of the wastefulness, no benefit arises. You turn on the tap and then you decide, oh, I need to get a towel from the linen closet. Just keep the tap running. Why? I'd have to close it. Is it that difficult to close the tap? Right? So a lot of waste happens out of laziness. You left the basement, you're going upstairs. There's no reason to keep the lights on. Do I have to turn off the lights every time? How many actions does it take? Raise hand, lower hand. Right? So just think of just keeping lights on at home. How difficult is it? So a lot of it happens through laziness. The fifth is weakness of self, which is what? Weakness of your sense of self, which is what common people call shyness. Right? Because there is praiseworthy shyness, which is to refrain from that which is unbecoming in the sight of Allah, or unbecoming when it comes to right conduct. Right? So if you don't want to do something unbecoming by right standards. Right? But in some cultures, for example, if you eat all the food on your plate, people say, oh, he's very greedy. So you don't eat everything on your plate. Why? Because you have a weak sense of self. That you're not a slave of society. You're a slave of Allah. Right? So that is not haya. That is not praiseworthy shyness. The Prophet ﷺ said, Allahu ahaqqu an yustaha minhu min an-nas. Allah is more deserving of your shyness than people are. So you're out with friends. Let's say you're from a cultural context where finishing the food is considered in poor taste. Islamically, you don't leave a piece of rice on the plate. So you eat it all. And that's where you have to have strength of spirit, that I do the right thing, not just what people say. Right? You're at a fundraiser and suddenly you realize that these guys are a bunch of jokers. Right? Because you asked, are you a registered non-profit? They said no. Said, do you have a plan for how you spend the money next year? Said no. Said, can you tell me what where you spend the money this year? Said no. Said, but trust us, brother, we're doing a lot of good. So you realize, I know many other places I could spend my charity money. But then, everyone on your table is giving $1,000 the $10,000 donations, so you put your money, you give $5,000. Why? Because you have weakness of spirit. And sometimes multiple things come. This is also showing off because you're acting for the recognition of people, but also you don't have the ability, you feel shy before people. And that's, and that's why one of the key spiritual qualities is called al-iktifa bi'ilmillah, finding sufficiency in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And the sixth reason is weakness of religion. So one just doesn't care. Right? Right? And that is knowledge without action results in weakness of faith. وَرُجِّحَتْ زِيَادَةُ الْإِيمَانِ بِمَا تَزِيدُ طَاعَةُ الْإِنسَانِ. The chosen opinion, says the author of Jahurat al-Tawheed, is that faith increases. Faith is strengthened by everything that strengthens one's state of obedience. Faith is not strengthened by knowledge alone. Right? So you may know everything about waste, but you are the most wasteful of people. Nas'al Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-afiyah. Right? So then he tells us how one removes each of these blameworthy traits. So he says, أما السفه الطبيعي
أما السفه الطبيعي فزواله عسير جدا فلذا نهى الشارع عن إيتاء المال له وأمرهم بحجره فإن أكثر الفقهاء ذهبوا إلى وجوب حجر السفيه المسرف مع أنه إهدار للآدمية وإلحاق بالحيوانات العجم والجمادات.
So as for the folly of temperament, someone who just has just naturally weak restraint, right? Removing this is difficult indeed. That's why Allah and His Messenger have prohibited giving the foolish their wealth, and rather commanded that such a person, if someone is squanderous of their wealth, right, that the matter be raised to the qadi and they be prevented from having the right of financial transaction. Right? So Uncle Sufyan finds out that his nephew inherited $1 million and he's spending it at a rate of $10,000 a weekend. And his nephew's parents are overseas, whatever. So in a Muslim society, you would have a moral duty to first, after advising him, to go to the judge and said, Your Honor, my cousin, Nashid, is squanderous of his wealth. So the judge, if he confirms that, could make hajr. What is hajr? That you're not that we block your access to your wealth. And the judge would appoint somebody, maybe Uncle Sufyan himself, that look, you're allowed to give him an allowance of $500 a week. But each week, at the end of each week, you give him $500. Uncle Sufyan says, okay. Why do we do this? For the good of the one squanderous of their wealth. And most of the jurists, because the Quranic verse is related to not giving the foolish their wealth, right? The verses from the opening of Surah An-Nisa, that it is obligatory for the judge to bar the foolish, the squanderous, and wasteful of their wealth, even though this would be a negation of the dignity of their humanity, and making them as if they are a unbeknownst animal or an inanimate object, that we're not recognizing that they are a dignified human being. Which is why Imam Abu Hanifa said, if someone reaches the age of 25 and they're still wasteful with their money, just give it to them. Because their wasting money is less harmful for them than the negation of the dignity of their humanity. But that's Abu Hanifa standing on his own. Even his two companions said, while that may be a very noble idea, but it's an optimistic view of humanity, that there are people who remain foolish past 25. And they may have gotten married. They may have children. And if we allow them to be squanderous, then they will harm themselves and they'll harm those dependent upon them. Now, if فإن قبل العلاج, if this folly of temperament accepts treatment, then
فبالمنع عن جلساء السوء وبإلزامه مجالسة العقلاء والحكماء وحمله وإسماعه ما ورد في آفات الإسراف وحمله على تكلف الإمساك ولو بالعتاب والعقاب.
Says, if the folly of temperament does accept treatment, right, then it is by having this person keep away from bad company, right? And whether it be the company of the spoiled rich kids or the status seekers, etc., and by making them keep the company of the intelligent and wise. And the intelligent are those who make right life choices, right? And also by saying, look, before you make decisions of this, and this type, consult somebody. And to make them listen to all that has come about the harms of wastefulness, because they may go from negligence to some degree of consideration, and to force them to make themselves withhold from spending by rebuking them or punishing them. Okay? That's why getting a mentor can be very helpful with these kinds of things, as we've mentioned. But also consulting that, okay, how do I deal with this type of wastefulness? Right? And then أما الجهل فيزال بالتعلم. And if someone is wasteful due to just simple ignorance, they just don't know that wastefulness is bad, that is dealt with by learning. وعلاج الرياء سبق. And the treatment for showing off has come before. And you can find it in the previous lessons. And then he says, أما الكسل والبطالة وهو الثاني والثلاثون من آفات القلب فمذموم جدا. And then how do you treat laziness and procrastination? And it says, and these together are the 32nd of the blameworthy traits of the heart. Then know that laziness and procrastination are extremely blameworthy. وحسبك فيه قوله تعالى وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى. And it's enough for you to know that Allah Most High says, and truly a person shall only have what they strived for. If you're lazy and you don't strive for anything, what will you have? Nothing. Right? That's why they say al-fawatu khusran. Missing out is loss. على نفسه فليبكي من ضاع عمره. Upon their own self let cry those who squandered their life. وليس له منها نصيب ولا سهم. And who doesn't have of it no part nor share. So next week, inshallah, we'll look at laziness and procrastination. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take us من وهن الكسل إلى قوة الجد. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. No, so foolishness, some people are born foolish. Like by foolishness, we don't mean they're silly or dumb, but that they have a weak capacity to make right choices. Okay? People are born, they don't think things through. If you could get into trouble, they'll be the first person to do so. Just lack of consideration. Okay? Now there's things that aggravate it. Negative external influences, company, etc. So you have to, one of the things to do is to reduce the negative external influences. And then to put barriers between yourself and your wasteful or hasty choices. And to put facilitators in place for making rightful choices. Right? So if you find yourself, whenever you're feeling lazy, you get on to the app for whatever website and you end up buying all kinds of silly things. Then just delete the app. Don't keep your credit card information on your phone. So anytime you have to enter it manually because it forces you to have to think, should I get this, should I not? A lot of the righteous, they would pray istikhara before making worldly decisions. And it's hard to forget because one day, my good friend Sohail Nakhuda and I had decided that we're going to have mansaf for lunch. It was going to be our one meal that day. A big, hefty meal. So I skipped breakfast. I'm not a good hunger kind of person. I'm going to go right after Salat al-Dhuhr in the masjid. After Dhuhr, my friend Sohail, he went down the hill with one of the scholars because they had to look at some choices related to typesetting. I'm stuck there waiting just to go for lunch with my friend for mansaf. So they're discussing what size font should be for the end notes of the book. It's a purely worldly decision, right? So one said, before we decide, let's look at how all the options look. Secondly, says, I'll do istikhara about this. So one of the many benefits of istikhara is it facilitates right choices. وَاخْدُرْ لِلْخَيْرَ حَيْثُ كَانَ ثُمَّ رَدِّنِي بِهِ. So you're thinking that, you know what? I think I need to upgrade my laptop. I say, Allah has blessed you with the money. You could do it. No problem. No, there is a problem. It could be wasteful. So what do? Don't go looking at the advertising. Advertising is not meant to help you make better choices. So consider, consult, consign the matter, and then pray istikhara. And then try to make the choice in light of the decision-making framework of the istikhara. Right, which is وَاخْدُرْ لِلْخَيْرَ حَيْثُ كَانَ. Destine the good for me, right, that which is good for me in my deen and my dunya, short term and long term, directly or indirectly. Right? Do I need this? Will it be of benefit? And sometimes you realize that no. As disappointing as it may be, right? Because often there are spectacular choices that one wants to make, but sometimes one realizes that boring works too. As disappointing as boring is. Sorry, I had to make a bunch of such technological choices for this year and the next. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.